Welcome to our Medical Dialogue virtual roundtable. My name is Dan Jenkins, and I work in the Partnerships Group in the School of Computer Science at Carnegie Mellon University. We're pleased to have you join our event today and look forward to hearing from you after the event if you have any questions about partnerships in the School of Computer Science. Without further ado, I'm honored to introduce Professor Eric Nyberg, who graciously agreed to serve as our event moderator. Eric's work in QA systems is legendary, and among his most notable accomplishments is pioneering work he did on the Watson project with IBM, as well as his role in helping to found formal computational data science studies in the School of Computer Science at Carnegie Mellon. Eric?
Thanks very much, Dan. As Dan mentioned, I'm a professor in the Language Technologies Institute in the School of Computer Science at CMU. I'm the current director of the Computational Data Science program, and I also continue to do research in question answering. I also have a local Pittsburgh company, Cognistics, which focuses on applications of AI and data science for industry. It's my pleasure to introduce our panelists. Today we have Carolyn Rose, who's a professor in the Language Technologies Institute and the Human-Computer Interaction Institute in the School of Computer Science at Carnegie Mellon University. We have Zach Lipton, who is a professor of operations research in the Tepper School of Business with a joint appointment in the Machine Learning Department in the School of Computer Science. We have Sandeep Konam, who's co-founder and chief technology officer at Abridge, a language technologies company operating in the healthcare space. And we have Danica Marinac-Dabic, associate director, Office of Clinical Evidence and Analysis Center for Devices and Radiological Health for the US Food and Drug Administration. So I want to thank you all for joining us today. The purpose of this gathering is to provide those in attendance with a targeted overview of current research and systems that focus on the acquisition and analysis of medical communications between medical providers, between providers and patients, as well as the systems which are being designed to provide clearer understanding of what the actionable data are for decision-making that come out of these interactions. Each of the panelists will make a brief presentation of relevant work and their view of where the field is headed, with a special focus on how healthcare systems and technology companies will be able to support progress for future research. A considerable amount of time will be dedicated to questions from our audience, as well as a few questions posed to us in advance. Please note, this event is on the record and it's being recorded. If you would like to pose a question, there is a button at the bottom of your Zoom app that says Q&A. Please post your question there and we'll try to get to it during the open Q&A session after today's presentation. Okay, so I'd like to invite Danica to begin, and her topic is gaps between real-world data and systems interoperability, dealing with information silos, assessing impact of new technologies on population health, improving data quality and transparency. Danica.
It looks I'm muted.
Okay.
Good afternoon, and thank you very much for inviting me. It's such a pleasure to be part of this innovative panel discussion. Let me put my screen up just a moment. Just checking if everyone can see my slides.
Looks good.
Great. So let me dive in straight since we only have 7 minutes for the opening remarks. I would like first to give you sort of a quick view of what is the device space within the Food and Drug Administration. We regulate over 190,000 devices produced by close to 20,000 the manufacturing companies, and there are 1,800 of us at CDRH that are working in all the phases of the total product life cycle. Of these 180,000 devices that we regulate, one particular area which might be of interest to you is, in fact, the area of innovative devices, the ones that are approved first of a kind, and how the trends in the FDA activity in that area looks. So as you can see here, from 2009 to 2020, the number of these devices authorized for use actually grew dramatically. Just to give you a sense of some of the examples of these novel technologies, and you can go on FDA website for more detailed information about them. For example, in the year of 2020, we approved the first game-based digital therapeutics to improve the attention function in children with attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. We also approved first cardiac ultrasound software that uses artificial intelligence to guide the users to capture quality diagnostic images, and many of others that are on the screen. In order to meet this very dynamic and changing field of innovative technologies, we've actually, over the past decade, completely changed the paradigm in which that we use to engage ecosystem stakeholders. So this is a slide that it's very busy, and I'm not going to dive into every single aspect of it. But what the message is that increasingly we are engaging external stakeholders from professional associations, from academia, from industry, from patient groups, by forming partnerships, public-private partnerships that actually move field forward. In 2010, we launched the first public-private partnership called Medical Device Epidemiology Network that I'm going to talk a little bit more about in the next few minutes. And then obviously culminating in 2016 when we launched the National Evaluation System for Health Technology as an umbrella organization to coordinate the work with many of these partnerships in this space. I also would like to give some clinical context and aspect of this great impact that innovation is making every day on the lives of our patients. And to tell you how much of this can be achieved by working together in the public-private partnerships. What happened? It looks like
Danica, we just lost your screen, so you'll
yes, I got the message. I'm not sure why. I'm going to try one more time. Just give me a second.
We can see your screen, but we can't see the slides.
The same here. So I'm trying to do one more time to reshare again. Just give me, my apologies. Not sure why. Can you see the screen now?
Yes.
Okay.
If you go to presentation mode, I think we'll be good.
Yeah, let me try to. Okay, my apologies for the. So this is what I was going to show to you what is what in fact public-private partnership can do. In 2011, we were the 42nd country in the world to approve one of the novel technologies called the transcatheter aortic valve replacement that gives an option to patients who cannot undergo the open heart surgery to in fact have their valves replaced. And obviously we wanted to change this track record and establish the national infrastructure that will capture the information about these technologies in parallel by the review process of approving the technology. And to make a long story short, many people, many agencies, many groups participated in this effort, including the CMS, including the American Society for Thoracic Surgery, and also the American College of Cardiology, to help support this effort. So basically, fast forward, when the third generation of this technology came up, we were only 18 days after the approval of this product in Europe. And for the mitral location, we were the first in the world. Even more importantly, the companies that utilized this infrastructure, when they had done the return on investment analysis, they quickly realized that they gained, in fact, 500% of return on investment by utilizing this national infrastructure versus being engaged in their one-off studies for each of these approvals. So for the we can discuss more about this in the discussion part, but I just wanted to tell you that this is really a huge impact that these public-private partnerships are making in the context of the approval. Some of the key themes that I would like to bring to your attention, and hopefully in the later discussion, we are going to dive in more into it. We are trying to modernize the real-world evidence through these partnerships. We are also trying to promote patient-centered outcome research, and also to leverage digital health solutions in that space, in which sense, in this particular case, I really think there might be a great interest from the Carnegie Mellon University to actually participate in these efforts. And also we are advancing the innovative infrastructure and methodologies for device lifecycle evaluation of these technologies. I'm gonna just give a quick examples of one partnership, one particular information system, and one architecture, just to give you some teasers about what we have done thus far, and then we'll even conclude with where the potential areas of growth and interest would be. One of the areas of increasing interest of FDA is what we like to call coordinated registry networks. This is really information systems that are envisioned to be strategically aligned, harmonized, and interoperable, to be able to provide more in-depth information about technologies more than traditional data sources can do. Meaning the registry is linked to claims data, registry is linked to electronic health records, patient-generated data, together provide much more comprehensive data source for assessing the performance of these technologies once they're approved for use. MD-EpiNet had been one of the first public-private partnerships that we established. This is just one of the snapshots from a recent series that we put together, and we would like to share much of this with you for the potential future collaborations. These are some of the thought leaders that had helped us launch this series back in November. The MD-EpiNet is coordinated by Weill Cornell Medical School, where we have the coordinating center, and it has a number of work streams, including methodology, informatics, automated surveillance, UDI adoption, stakeholder development, claims-based research, and others. We have recently, we were very fortunate to receive funding from the Patient-Centered Outcome Research Trust Fund Foundation to help us move these registries and coordinated registry networks forward. You will be particularly interested to look into these several work streams that focus on development and application of novel methodologies and innovative infrastructure, including natural language processing, machine learning, AI, and helping with bridging the more traditional data sources with the novel data sources and novel tools that exist in this space. Here is just one of the architectural advancements that we've made in collaboration with Hive, high performance integrated virtual environment. And this is just to demonstrate how much it can be done when these innovative infrastructure can serve as a way of cloud-based data sources with integrated technologies and with integrated methodologies to be able to provide us curated and trusted information moving forward. I just would like to say that this architecture is not housed at FDA. This is cloud-based and done in collaboration with a number of academic sites, including a recent addition to the blockchain capabilities to ensure the data provenance, to ensure the trusted way of capturing the information and being able to provide a really 21st century infrastructure for future research. And this is how things looks like now with integrated blockchain technologies into this platform. And finally, I would like to conclude with the following. Although we have done major steps in modernizing some of these infrastructures in the real world evidence scenario, there are still a lot of areas of need and areas of growth. For example, we would like to make sure that all the architecture and methodologies that we develop continue to ensure the compliance with healthcare and federal government requirements. So there is a work to be done, future work to be done in that space. Building trust among diverse stakeholders is also very important, especially patients and other communities. Democratization of access to the data, again, a key to ensuring the approaches that can meet all stakeholders' needs. Strengthening computing and learning models in this space, again, something that I hope that Carnegie Mellon community will be very much engaged in the future. Promoting patient-driven sort of development of capabilities in this space, and also stimulating overall innovation in these technologies. So basically, I would conclude with this, with my thank you, and hopefully in the next hour or so, we're going to have an opportunity to ask for questions and responses. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Danica. Very compelling work, and I think it's going to set us up well for discussing some of the questions that we've already gotten in the Q&A, which is excellent. So next, I'd like to invite Carolyn to speak to us. She's going to talk about how to use linguistic insights to overcome modeling challenges for process mining and information extraction from medical conversations. Carolyn?
Great, thank you. It has been estimated that about 80% of medically relevant insights and information are bound up in text of some form. And since the rise of the social web, more and more of this is conversational, either on Twitter or in discussion forums or interactions on people's blogs or in other forms. And so being able to apply NLP and other machine learning technologies to this kind of data has a great potential to contribute towards some of the efforts, for example, that Danica has mentioned in her talk just recently. Over the past 10 years, medical conversations have been one of the big sources of data that my group has been focusing on in a variety of NLP related tasks that you see displayed on this slide. And in this work, we have had one foot in the medical informatics community in publication venues such as JAMIA, and also in the NLP community in conferences like ACL, EMNLP, etc. So my group focuses on two main areas, which Eric mentioned briefly just now, and that is extracting relevant information from medical conversations and also modeling effective interaction processes, where extracting the information can support things like decision-making. The interaction processes are important to understand because of their impact on the people who participate in the conversation. So for example, in terms of increasing trust in doctors, and that therefore increasing uptake of medical advice. So both of these areas of machine learning research involve, at least in my work, I would say the big hallmark of the work that we do is leveraging interdisciplinary insights into the data, a real data focus in order to achieve success. So one example is work on extraction of medical entities and events. Akanksha Naik, one of my PhD students, has been doing work surveying across approaches to domain adaptation, which is really important, especially in medical information extraction applied to dialogue, since the annotated data sources are generally much less well available than for other kinds of data. And so we're experimenting with adapting models for event extraction from news to medical notes or news to medical dialogue. And as we survey across the different approaches that are available, we see that the ranking between them varies quite substantially depending upon the topic area and whether we're talking about notes or dialogue. And as we probe deeply into the data, we see why in terms of how there's an alignment or misalignment between the vocabulary and syntactic constructions across these domains, from what was learned to where it's being transferred. It's also a great challenge to be able to extract information from patient turns in doctor-patient interactions, in particular because of the role that they play in those conversations. So these we need to understand are expert layperson interactions where there's an asymmetry between the roles, where the patients are usually the ones who are responding to the doctors. And so the doctor turns are much more technical and explicit and set up the context in which the patient turns have to be interpreted. And the topic focus of these conversations shifts very frequently. And although there's kind of a schema for a doctor's visit at one abstract level, it rarely plays out exactly that way. And so it's important to be able to ground the topic focus in the places where it's more reliably found in the conversations, and then to be able to kind of work out in an island driven sort of way to understand what's happening in those conversations. And so all of these insights into how conversation works feed into our design of representations of the data and of the neural architectures that we use to be able to do the extraction. And here I'm just displaying very briefly, not going to get into the details, but some work from another student of mine, Sopan Kozla, whose EMNLP paper from 2020 focused on how to reliably extract information from patient turns in medical conversations. In addition to doing basic work and research in this area, we also have some tools like this web service for medical concept normalization that builds on top of 5 of the most popularly used tools for concept normalization in medical informatics, and improves over all of their performances using some augmented data sources that were curated from the web at ground scale. In terms of understanding the processes of the conversations, we have been looking across both medical conversations and educational conversations for common processes and how they build on attitudes and dispositions of the people in the conversations that lead to processes at the psychological level and ultimately are seen at the linguistic level and then have their impact on outcomes that can be measured. And so these component processes of deep listening, comparing of mental models, and sharing of insights are really important component parts of this process that cut across both medical and educational conversations. And they're predicated on respect, trust, interest, and self-efficacy, which are not directly observable, but there are clues that can be found in the communication patterns between people. And understanding the interplay between these levels allows us to do a better job at the modeling so that we can learn things about these processes and how they contribute towards outcomes. And in particular, in the doctor-patient interaction space, we're working with Glenn Elwin at Dartmouth University to begin to explore how we might be able to track processes in conversation that lead to the experience of shared decision-making on the part of patients. Across the computational work that we do in this space to be able to monitor processes that are related to building knowledge together, with regardless of which paradigms we're working in, whether it be probabilistic graphical modeling versus neural nets that are more frequent and whatever we move on to in 5 years. All of our big breakthroughs have been from leveraging insights into the linguistic properties of the data as they connect to processes that we can understand, for example, from the standpoint of social psychology. In our most recent work, we're looking at medical conversations in Twitter between doctors and how networks of doctors on Twitter are taking up, transforming, and transmitting messages that originate in scientific literature and also reports that come out of places like the FDA, and yet they may not fully take up the message as delivered in best practices, but may transform them in light of their own experiences in their local practices on the ground. And so if we can monitor how those processes are taking place, we might be able to anticipate some unsavory events that could happen in the future and maybe do something about them before they become problems. And I'll end there.
Thank you, Carolyn. So now I'd like to move on and invite Sandeep to speak next. And he's going to talk about unlocking value for doctors and patients from their medical conversations. So go ahead, Sandeep.
Thanks, Eric. Can you see my slides?
Yes.
Perfect. Awesome. So at Abridge, we are working to bring compassion and confidence to every step of a person's health journey. We are supported by some incredible investors, advisors, and clinical partners. The problem that we're trying to solve is something that most of us might have experienced at one point or the other. As patients, when we engage in a clinical conversation with doctors, oftentimes there is a lot of information being exchanged. Sometimes we might be anxious, absent-minded, or really sick more than anything, and end up not understanding and remembering all the doctor's advice, treatment plans, and recommendations. If we don't understand or remember what a doctor said, how can we follow the care plan? And if we cannot follow through on care plan, how can we improve our health outcomes? That's why we created Abridge, to help people understand and follow through on their care. Our thesis has been that upstream of all the diagnostics, therapeutics, labs, imaging, and a whole bunch of healthcare services, there is a conversation that happens between a patient and their doctor. If we can help everyone capture those conversations, then we can also help them unlock so much more value. We can help them understand and act upon their care, and over time, improve their health outcomes. Using our mobile app available for free on the App Store and Play Store, anyone can easily and securely capture the medical conversations they have with their doctors across the care continuum from home to hospital. Once a user has that recording, our machine learning algorithms transcribe, extract, and highlight the key clinical concepts and define the medical jargon at a consumer reading level. In this picture on the right, you see definitions that we curated with help from Mayo Clinic, National Library of Medicine, and other trusted partners. We also built machine learning systems that can extract next steps or takeaways and nudge users so that they don't forget to take medications and that they remember to schedule the follow-up appointments and tests. All the value we provide to patients and doctors depends on our ability to process, understand, extract, and structure information from medical dialogues. Structuring information from medical dialogues is a very tough challenge. That's because fundamentally, medical dialogues are complex. That complexity starts all the way from the quality of microphones. Our users have different kinds of phones, and this impacts the signal quality, which affects the transcription quality and performance of all the downstream systems. Similarly, distance to speakers, background noise, accents, disfluencies, broken utterances, interruptions, overlapping speech, and a variety of other challenges, all stemming from how human beings naturally communicate with each other, contribute to this complexity. Doctors and patients constantly switch between colloquial language and medical jargon. Then there is shared context that is spread across the conversation with a lot of back and forth, especially in cases where they discuss medications or past medical history. There is topic switching and knowledge asymmetry that Carolyn already highlighted. Given this is an audio-only conversation, we don't have access to non-verbal cues that can be crucial for complete understanding of the conversation. To solve all these challenges and more, we are investing heavily in research, both in-house at Abridge and also via close collaboration with groups at CMU and UPMC. This is a snapshot of some of our key areas that we focus on, all of them mapping to our mission of helping everyone understand and follow through on their care. To quickly skim through some of these research areas, we invest in speech recognition technologies with a special focus on medical words. This is an example of our domain adaptation work that can correct transcription errors from off-the-shelf APIs. Here you can see that Google's API incorrectly transcribes pacemaker as tastemaker and atrial fibrillation as Asian populations. Our module referred to as S2S here corrects both these errors. So this is a sample of our investment in the ASR correction bucket. We invest in information extraction research. This is an example of our medication extraction work where we extract and highlight medications and associated attributes like frequency, route, dosage, etc. We invest in classification research to ensure that we can identify and point users to parts of the conversation that are relevant and important, like next steps and takeaways. This work is already in production, and so far we've delivered more than 90,000 takeaways to our users. We wanted to make sure that this classifier works equally well across various population groups. So as a first step towards ensuring fairness, we measured differences in how well our machine learning model performs, depending on which population group is selected. You can learn more about this and all our machine learning work broadly at abridge.com/ML. All this research is powered by some large proprietary data sets. We have access to around 10,000 hours of de-identified and consented audio conversations. A key point to note here is that none of this data is from our users and is independently collected for research purposes. But there is potential to further expand the data set in a de-identified way based on interest from our users. All these conversations also have verbatim transcripts and rich annotations that we created, pouring in a lot of time and energy. We also have access to millions of clinical notes to help with our language modeling efforts. As mentioned earlier, we are excited about our ongoing collaboration with researchers at CMU. I'm happy to share more about this later if anyone is interested. Thanks so much and looking forward to the discussion. With that, I'll pass the mic maybe to Eric.
Thank you, Sandeep. Very interesting. So now let's hear from Zach Lipton, who's going to talk to us about summarization and decision-making from bioinformation. Zach.
Hey. Hey, thanks, Eric. So I'll speak, the title is going to be a bit aspirational in that we only have, I guess, in theory, we only have 7 minutes, although maybe we're running a bit over schedule. But I'll focus more in this conversation about summarization, but provide at least to give a little bit of context of the kinds of challenges that my lab works on and that we find interesting and that we think are the big obstacles, not just concerning NLP, but maybe in making machine learning useful in healthcare more broadly. Cool. Y'all can see my slides? I'll take the silence as confirmation. Great. So I run a group that we kind of coyly call the Approximately Correct Machine Intelligence Lab at CMU. The name refers both maybe to those of you who know machine learning theory just a little bit, to the sort of main paradigm for thinking about learning algorithms, that they are what can you get from finite samples, and it's you can approximately, probably approximately, with high probability recover a function that's somewhat close to the one that you seek. But also, the flavor of research, the sort of dual meaning for us is the ways that machine learning, the way it's thrown at real world problems is often there's something else that's sort of an approximation, which is the problem formulation itself. So basically we have, one set of tools that is really reduced to practice that we're really good at, which is predict, something unseen given something seen. So we call this supervised learning, and it's sort of the workhorse for nearly all the technology that we're talking about. Certainly when we're speaking about medical applications of machine learning. The trick is that, usually we're trying to do something like drive decisions, or we're trying to build a product that acts in a dynamic and changing world. So we're addressing some kind of problem for which this whole setting of like, assume that I have just a stream of endless examples from some fixed distribution, and that I just want to learn to infer something that in general will be sort of unseen given some information that will be available, is usually only sort of like a coarse approximation to the problem that we want to solve. So we're usually applying machine learning even when the prediction problem is sort of well formed. We're actually applying it in the real world in this kind of heuristic fashion and sort of hoping for the best. And so this, becomes a big problem in healthcare when, predicting the likelihood, you're predicting, the likelihood that someone will survive given that they are on the drug is not the same thing as estimating the treatment effect of, for this person, what would happen if you put them on a drug other than the one that would have been assigned historically? What would be the impact? To drive decisions, you care more about, grappling with these kinds of causal quantities. You need systems that aren't just going to make good predictions for your historical data, but even insofar as prediction is what you care about, you want to be able to make good predictions in the wild, even when things are changing. So one line of research, so these are my students here. The student who's enlarged is Kundan, who's been driving the summarization work that I'll talk about. Some work that my student Helen's doing right now is we're looking at just how badly models suffer as they sort of go stale. The typical workflow is that you train a model on some data and then you're going to throw it out in the wild, and the world's going to continue to evolve and change, and people will be speaking about different things, and different diseases will be occurring with different frequencies. And the fact that a model is fairly accurate on historical data is not necessarily a great assurance that it will continue to perform in the way you might hope. So we work both from a theoretical angle and on these kinds of practical applications on, how can we sort of assess whether models are reliable and robust even under changing conditions, and under what kinds of, modest assumptions can we even guarantee that they'll be robust or reliable? So I've been working in healthcare since maybe the very beginning of my research career. I kind of like made a hard left turn into research from being a musician, and maybe the last place that I went to on my way driving to San Diego to start my PhD was I stopped in LA at what was then called MuckMed, which was a kind of, a silly, affectionate name for a little informal symposium held at Children's Hospital Los Angeles, which is now morphed into the publishing conference, which is machine learning for healthcare. And so I've been involved in, as long as I've been involved in machine learning research, which is, I guess, relatively short amount of time for a faculty member. I guess I'm on the early end, but it's for as long as I've been involved in research, I've been involved in research on machine learning for healthcare. And I've gotten to see, a bit of an evolution, which is at the moment that I joined the field was maybe right before people sort of started taking deep learning and neural networks, or at least their sort of the renaissance in those technologies as a more general concern. And they had just sort of demonstrated these breakthrough results in computer vision. And so people in vision were paying a lot of attention, people in ML were paying attention, but there was also a lot of skepticism that maybe these things only worked for images and they didn't necessarily work more broadly. So there's been this evolution from a period of time where the dominant sort of mode of work on ML in healthcare that I saw was sort of simple prediction problems, tabular data, sort of canonical models like, random forests, logistic regression, things like this, to a world in which we use sort of fancy prediction models that, operate according to principles that we don't understand, but are able to deal with kind of messier kinds of data. And this is, work on like neural networks and sequence models applied to things like clinical time series data. And that's some of the work that I cut my teeth on. And then, where I see things going is sort of two things. On one hand, there's yet fancier prediction, which is maybe what the summarization work falls under. And also this getting beyond the IID prediction. How can we build systems that will, reliably guide decisions, even, when we're not just facing this IID prediction problem, but really the world's changing, or we care about something like estimating treatment effects. So some of the first work I did was adapting work that had just sort of had breakthrough results in language to the healthcare setting, not on healthcare language, but actually on sort of numerical values from electronic health records, like the frequently charted information, like, respiratory monitors and vital signs and frequently run serological testing. And we got some of the earliest results that were applying sort of like modern sequential deep learning techniques on this type of data That was in about 2016. So I guess that was a long time ago in the timescales of modern machine learning. We since have done things like adapting models to improve the efficiency of fertility specialists for trying to basically, when they decide which embryo to implant, they need some kind of score, and they assess this based on determining how quickly did the embryo reach certain developmental milestones. And so we developed some technology that's able to pinpoint the precise location of the embryo, even without having direct supervision on this, and then based on that extracted region, classify what is its stage of development, and get to a point where, if we had a bit more data, we might even be able to incorporate this into clinical practice. And more recently, I've been working directly with Sandeep and his colleagues over at Abridge, where my lab and Abridge have been working together on the task of summarization. And I'll just touch on this very briefly. We've been working on these semi-structured clinical summaries. So it's still raw text, but they're organized into these sections: the subjective, objective, the assessment, and the plan. These are notes that doctors make on sort of every single visit. And this is, on one hand, it's great because it's a sort of enduring document that, you have this record of the state of the patient after every single visit. On the other hand, creating and storing these notes as sort of clean digital documents is a tremendous burden for the physicians. And so there's a problem, the burdens of digital documentation have emerged as sort of a leading contributor to physician burnout. And the question is, can we build, we're not so naive as to think that we could just throw neural networks at this and that we'll just take, assume that whatever comes out is correct and throw it directly into the patient record. But if we did a good job of summarization, you could imagine a tool that would be useful either as an assistive, smart editing tool, the way that Gmail helps you write an email. You still want to read anything before you send it. Or you can imagine even that you would want to generate a first draft of a note that the doctor could subsequently edit. And if at least pulled out, all the right symptoms, all the right medicines, the right date for the follow-up visit, that would save the doctor some time. So on this side, we've been exploring a whole spectrum of approaches. And one of the first things we've done is to sort of look at this data. A typical NLP benchmark will look at data sets that consist of where the inputs might be a news article, so maybe like 1,000 words or something like this. And the summaries in canonical, sort of NLP benchmarks for summarization tasks are often 1 to 2 sentences long, like for CNN Daily Mail. The setting we're in is we're trying to generate a document that's something like a page, given a transcript of a conversation, which was maybe 20 minutes long. And so coping with this scale is a huge problem. So we've explored different ways. You can't even feed in the whole conversation to a single neural network model and have it fit in memory. So ways of breaking down this task into first going through the conversation, pulling out the sentences in the conversation, or the utterances in the conversation that are likely to relate to a sentence that'll be documented in the note. And then, this sort of different ways. Like one is you could just try to generate the whole note in one shot from the conversation, but that doesn't seem to work too well. You could try to just extract relevant sentences and then just feed them to an abstractive summarization model. Or you can, incorporate even more structure, like try to extract the sentences that are relevant to each subsection of the note, then group them together in terms of which sentences are likely to support the same summary sentence. And then finally, just generate, translate those utterances into the corresponding summary sentence. And this turns out to be by far the most effective model that we have. And so we've been really exploring this spectrum of approaches for approaching the summarization problem. So I won't go into too many details about the architectures that we use. You can see as an example here, this is a model that has gone through these steps of you started off with a whole conversation, you pulled out the noteworthy utterances for each sentence, you clustered together the groups of utterances that you think should go together to support a common, a particular sentence in the summary. And then finally, you feed those into an abstractive model that converts them into what they should look like. So on the left, you have, the doctor says the one thing that we could do to reduce risk is with a cholesterol is 100 milligrams of metoprolol, or however you pronounce that. And he says, I want you on 2 a day. And then the summary version of that, once we've extracted that, the summary version, as it appears in a bullet point in the medical note, is just metoprolol 100 milligrams twice a day. And you can see how sometimes even the same sentences, if you tell the abstractive module that it's generating the component corresponding to a different subsection, it'll generate a slightly different variation on the sentence. Like if it's supposed to be part of the history of present illness, it might just say history of heart disease. If it's supposed to be the medication section, which is generally a terse bulleted list of educations, and it'll just say digoxin. And then if it's part of the assessment, it'll say the patient is on digoxin. So there's a lot of next steps here that we're excited about, but I mean, among other things, there's sort of actually getting towards the interactive side of this, of putting it in the loop with real doctors and seeing how they use these tools, trying to figure out how we can actually integrate into the system to guide better decisions, how we can handle distribution shift as the kinds of conversations we see are evolving over time. So there's a lot to this, but I'll end here and we can stay for the live conversation.
Thanks, Zach, and thanks to all of the panelists for providing some background on their different areas of emphasis. Now we're going to switch to Q&A. And Dan had invited me to kick things off with any questions that I might have. But I'm actually going to go right into the questions that we have in the Q&A, because I personally think that they're the most relevant questions that we need to consider. And also because I think we have people among the panelists who are going to be able to help us with these questions. So the first question is as follows, and then I'm going to direct part of this to Sandeep and part of this to Danica. So get ready, guys. The question is, I know IBM recently has begun attempts to divest their Watson Health because of data privacy and interpretability. Are these fundamental limitations? If not, how so? So my own experience working in bioinformatics resonates with this quite well. One might have thought that the biggest challenge for Watson Health would have been the complexity of the inference and the algorithms required to match symptoms, to conditions. But in fact, it's getting over the privacy hurdles to get access to the data, and also dealing with all of the proprietary data standards that are siloed into tools like Epic and so forth, which have basically got a lock, on the EHR market. So first I want to ask Sandeep, what do you think about the privacy issue? It seems to me like you guys have some solutions there since you've collected a lot of data. Do you think the time is right for us to sort of open up and get more data from consumers? Or do you think this still remains a challenge outside of the area you've been working in?
Yeah, that's a great question, because I think when it comes to privacy, like what's often invoked is HIPAA as a data kind of a framework or like a legal regulation that's supposed to help people access their own data from healthcare providers, and also in keeping that data private. But what it's turned out to be is that even patients can hardly get access to their own data because providers sometimes invoke HIPAA and all that. So we are seeing, I think, positive momentum there in that patients are willing to share their data with companies if they benefit from it from a care standpoint, like improving their healthcare outcomes and things like that. But I think what's still happening with most of this like mega big tech deals is systems, like major systems, like large healthcare systems working with like big tech companies to just kind of like siphon off data without patients' consent. And that's the real problem. With Abridge, I think we've taken a very serious stance of why privacy is important and ensuring that it like patients own, control, and create their own data in a sense. So we don't share data without consent of the user. And a user can delete the data at any point. And delete means delete. We don't like preserve copies and all that kind of stuff. So it's just, I think, transparency, establishing trust with users, and communicating clearly that this is like this AI and machine learning, what are the technologies, because at the end of the day, patients care about the outcomes and doctors should too. So I think that's the stance we've taken broadly on the data privacy.
So do you think that we need more government policy and regulations to basically promote easier access to our own medical data? Because you make it sound like the healthcare providers are not as forthcoming as they could be, and that if they had more of a motivation or an impetus, we might have a world where everyone is able to, carry around their, health data on a memory stick or some suitably, secure version thereof. Do you think that some push from the government is going to be required to make that happen?
Totally. I think policy support is extremely important for this thing. And there are advancements being made on that front, both from data interoperability standpoint and data portability, so that patients can control their data as step one, and then they decide who they want to share their data with. And that can be a huge unlock in terms of what kind of technologies get built and how they benefit in turn from that data.
Very cool. Okay, Danica, I want to turn to you now. Since you represent the FDA and you certainly, have your finger on the pulse of, what's going on in government. You spoke to us about the idea of networks that focus on how to share data using common standards. But I think that, the reality on the ground is that for a company like GE to suddenly transfer all of their medical data into a common canonical format means that they're kind of giving up some proprietary hold, let's say, on data that can right now only operate within their, medical information system. So where do we need to go with this? Should companies, bear the cost of converting all of their data into a government mandated canonical form, that can be shared with, consumers? Or do you think that we have to work more towards a world where everybody creates the data, from a single standard to begin with?
So one needs to unpack your question definitely in multiple sort of levels or domains. The issue of privacy and interoperability is extremely important, especially for the regulatory setting. And increasingly more important because we're trying to bridge the pre-market with post-market environment, meaning, from clinical trials to actual real-world utilization, which in fact, it's very important to be seen as continuum. So the privacy of it really is, it's important to understand, what's needed out there and what is, and what we can do about this, including the interoperability. So we have done a number of steps in that direction, especially in the medical device space. Unfortunately, I didn't have a chance to spend more time on it, but across a variety of clinical areas, in a very interdisciplinary, multi-stakeholder spirit, we've started chartering those core minimum data sets in the way how they should look like, not because FDA said so, but because it's the most meaningful way of informing the actual users, the patients, and others. So in order for those to become well accepted, we're going through all full steps of making things, Fire compatible, smart on Fire, with all these resources being embedded, and embedding them to the HL7 process. So then, in fact, we would like to come closer between what clinical space needs and what the standards are saying us to do. Mm-hmm. It's not always a solution to having new policies because we often don't implement the policies that we currently have. So that's the one point that I would like to make. The other point has to do with the patient control over their own data. We have done, especially in the MD-EpiNet public-private partnership, a couple of demonstration projects that speak about some of the lessons learned in that space. For example, in the space of patient-powered registries, we've really put in motion these engines that capture data and entered by patients through the patient portals, and patients can control who can have access to the data. By installing the blockchain technology and those ledgers there, we ensure that traceability of all transactions. So this is really something that, in terms of the data provenance, is really important. The other one was a Hugo software that was developed by Yale team, which is again another way of having patients, having a control of their data and not necessarily needing to adhere to the HIPAA requirements, which opens another door to being able to have this more of a patient-centric way. But I would say the following: for the future, we've seen obviously what's happening with Google that sort of closed the health vertical. With IBM, we are seeing all these, which was part of the question. Now, how the market is going to position itself, is Microsoft going to step in to fill in the sort of the void. Are there going to be other areas in which we are going to see some movements and shaking in the market space? But from the government side, Office of National Coordinator will continue to have a prominent role, along with other groups that can, you know, work together to push toward the standards.
Excellent, thank you. So now I have a question for Carolyn. How do you screen Dr. Twitter? They must express their own personal opinions about the papers that they're reading, as well as, you know, sharing, let's say, you know, or communicating best practices or changes in best practices that emerge from a paper, right?
Yeah, that's the point, actually. And I should say we're really just beginning this work. But what we see is that in our networks of doctors, they link to official reports. So it's easy to distinguish between what they're saying and what they're referring to. And we can see them telling stories about what they see in their practices and what they've decided to do. So it's very interesting. But as we're just beginning this work, I can't say what's come out of it yet in terms of, you know, that we have stopped some big disaster from happening or something. But it does seem very interesting to see how much skepticism that is being expressed towards recommendations that they're being told, and they're saying, how can we do this if this is what we're seeing, you know? And so I really feel like that gives evidence that this source of information is going to end up being valuable.
I see. So it's kind of almost like a public comment database on papers that are being published. And you can literally use that to sort of decide how digestible this new result is for people who are actually practicing. That's pretty neat.
Yeah.
Yeah. Very nice. So go ahead and type your questions into the Q&A, folks, if you have them. Don't hold back. So the next question is, how are you handling the cold start problem? For example, any new drugs or new diseases that are not in your training data. This is probably relevant to both Sandeep and Zach. So why don't we start with Zach?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think it's various forms of the cold start problem show up in, I think, you know, almost any domain in which machine learning is applied. So I mean, like one of the most common times you hear about cold start problems is when you're building recommendation systems and you're like, okay, well, I have users and I have items and I can infer, okay, users similar to you based on their past purchases, like items similar to the ones that you like or something like that. But what do you do when a new product shows up? So you don't have any purchase history to call upon or a new user. And in that case, you know, those kinds of pairing problems, you try to deal with a cold start problem by, for example, instead of just learning like latent factors associated with all the kinds of entities, you say, well, you're gonna have something that's conditioned upon their attributes. And maybe even if you don't have any history, the attributes are available. So you have something, you have this attribute condition model that can infer an embedding, and that's something that you can fall back on. In the broader like classification setting, like you say, let's say you just had like a medication extractor and you want to, you know, have it react gracefully when a new drug's present. It's a good question, and you know, there's not like a single right answer or established methodology. Well, one thing that you could sometimes do, so one way that people approach the idea of being confronted with the new class is there's a framing that's broadly like related to something called positive and unlabeled learning. So it's you can say something like, you can imagine it that I've only seen instances, you know, from some set of classes, and now in the future I might see a new class represented, and I want to be able to say, can I detect like when such an event has occurred, and say, then the next step is I might want to say give some kind of guarantee, like I believe at least a certain fraction of the new data belongs to this class, and then maybe even further, more ambitiously, I'd want to say, not just do I believe at least a certain fraction of the new data represents some class that I haven't previously seen, but these are the examples. The danger is that all of these different methodologies, like anything where you're sort of stepping outside the distribution of data that you've seen previously, in general, almost any kind of framing of a problem that involves stepping outside of the distribution of data that you've seen previously is, in general, an impossible problem. So you can't just like say like in general, like I've seen data that came from, planet A, and I'm going to see data from planet B, and I want the model to work. If I can't assume anything about what the planet A and planet B have in common, then you're truly dead in the water. You can come up with multiple plausible scenarios in which each one, what you're supposed to do or what you'd like the model to do would be different. And so then the question is, what can you assume? What are the reasonable assumptions? And these are usually fairly strict, but there's some way to like map on to which is maybe the most appropriate assumption for your kind of data. You need some kind of structural knowledge. I think the way these things are handled in practice is a mixture of coming at it from maybe this kind of like first principles way of I want to develop a coherent algorithm for addressing this kind of problem, and a messier sort of like business process sort of approach where at the end of the day, like if you're encountering new crap that you haven't seen before and you want your model to continue to be reliable and work, there's sort of at some point no getting around that there is some amount of human monitoring and labor. And if you look at all these companies, if you look at Google, who's as to the extent that anyone has a whole lot riding on a single sort of data-driven algorithm, it's the $1 trillion that Google has riding on search. And at the end of the day, they don't have this process automated. At the end of the day, they every single day are subsampling from their queries and feeding these past a bunch of human sort of quality raters that are doing some kind of manual search quality. And they might have some automated tools that flag things that they think are particularly concerning or potentially misclassified or might fall into some criteria. But at the end of the day, I think dealing with these things gracefully is going to involve, in any practical system, some amount of coming up with clever algorithms to flag things that are potentially concerning, and then having humans that make sure that like, these assumptions you're making, because at some point, otherwise you'll eventually go off the rails. You'll decide that there's some new word that's just like a common word. You'll decide it's a drug, and then you'll start flagging it as a drug everywhere. And if you eventually let the model just sort of make its decisions and then incorporate them into like future iterations as though they were ground truth, you'll get in trouble.
So we need to think about more cognitive ensembles of doctors or clinicians and systems working together to basically rapidly build new models where there's a sparsity of data, rather than assuming that the techniques that work well on legacy data are going to work well when new data about new concepts or classes are trickling. Yeah.
Sure. And like arguably in a lot of domains where maybe if you read the academic literature, you wouldn't think that's what's going on. When you look at if you look at an academic paper on like a content moderation for like social networks, it would usually just be about better detection. But if you go to Facebook and say, what are they actually doing? It involves like a combination of some algorithms that are trained to detect like not safe for work content, whatever, and about 30,000 paid contractors who are looped together with these algorithms, some kind of process that is somewhat opaque to, part of why we don't deal with it in academia is we don't fully understand what they're even doing because they're not very public about it. But
yeah. Carolyn?
Yeah, I guess I'd just like to very briefly inject. I think there's a kind of middle of the road approach where we don't have to treat every new planet as a totally new planet. But if we can understand the reasons why between planets we see different patterns, we might be able to anticipate for a third planet what kinds of differences we would see that might inform how we can move towards generalization. And I think that's where it kind of connects back to what I was saying a little bit in my talk about emphasizing the linguistic insights and being able to formalize maybe kind of a middle representation level that explains, the bridge between the language and the representation, and why is it different when you move to a different domain.
Great.
Can I add a couple of things?
Sure.
So I wanted to say that obviously with the full understanding that one cannot really equate what I'm going to say with what was said, but it's really important to draw some lessons from the similar scenarios that we have in a traditional evidence generation. Whenever the first of a kind technology comes to be developed or evaluated, there is always this sort of problem or dilemma of how you're going to generate the evidence, what's going to be your concurrent comparison group, how you're going to actually define this in the context of available evidence, what type of Bayesian approaches you may actually use to rely on something that was collected prior? Are there any adaptation of the trial that can exist to contribute to less burdensome evidence collection, but at the same time be something that, let's say, FDA will accept as the evidence? So even though you're talking about training your model and machine learning, artificial intelligence sort of integration of the data, I think the problem is not unique to this space. We actually are dealing with this at every level of evidence generation throughout the entire life cycle. And at one point, it might be of interest maybe to see what lessons we can learn from more of a traditional way of thinking, and vice versa.
Great. Okay, so now I have a question for Sandeep.
Actually, like really quickly adding to that, because that's a great question in the context of COVID-19, because when COVID happened last year, we've noticed that our systems, they don't transcribe COVID-19 well. They don't detect remdesivir. They don't detect hydroxychloroquine. So when COVID happened, and we've noticed that users are having these conversations that have this terminology, but we didn't prepare for that, right? Like no one prepared for that. So we had to manually curate this set of like rules and ontologies that we can fine tune our models with, so that we can transcribe them well, we can extract them, we can understand that something is a medication, we can understand something is diagnosis, and also prepare for some definitions. So it was like kind of looking at the entire pipeline and systems that we have and ensuring that we have enough of a coverage when something like this happens.
It's interesting. So it makes sense that it wouldn't recognize COVID and also remdesivir.
Right.
But hydroxychloroquine's a funny one because it never caught on, and it seems it was never actually effective at treating COVID. However, hydroxychloroquine's like a many decades old drug that is like a first line treatment for lupus, and is also like a common anti-malarial.
Yeah.
That's interesting trivia.
Yeah, it's like it was just a pre-existing problem that it happened to be bad at transcribing hydroxychloroquine.
Right. So Sandeep, the question that I wanted to direct your way, what scalability issues do you encounter or anticipate encountering, and what's your approach to addressing them? So for example, let's say, you broaden your business to sort of every doctor-patient, conversation on the planet. What are the bottlenecks, and what would your plans be for addressing that?
Yeah, great question. I mean, I think there is complexity all the way, like again, as I mentioned in the presentation, in terms of how maybe our current data set doesn't cover all the domains, all kinds of medical conversations. And especially with the shift to telehealth, most of the doctor visits are like short enough that there is not a lot of like detail being exchanged. Like it's very like transactional conversations. So there is that shift in the way information is being exchanged. And again, things like demographics and people across all spectrums, whether it is like rural, urban centers, because through COVID, we also had to build a telehealth solution specifically to ensure that people who don't have smartphones and people like who are in the rural centers, how to also bring them onto this telehealth thing. And we built a phone-based solution, because phone is one of these like democratized tools that all of them already have access to. So it's some of these challenges where when we first started like 3 years ago at UPMC, it was a nice sandbox for us to iterate and like improve the value based on an ideal conversation. Now, as we get into this wild and see all kinds of conversations, so we are trying to like, again, tweak and improve our models, right from the transcription to like information extraction to cover all kinds of clinical domains. And then there is the value that we're trying to like provide with the follow-up and like the next steps and takeaways.
So you'd probably get into a lot more fundamental research around
right.
collecting speech data in noisy bus stations and other kinds of, hostile environments for speech signals as well, if you were really going to democratize things.
Totally. And there is a whole set of like non-researchy, like just integrations and how most of these health data systems don't talk to each other. So how do we still fit in the workflow, but at the same time stay decoupled enough that we can prioritize consumers' needs and like their privacy requirements, and not kind of like fall into this old playbook of building for providers, pharma companies, and like build something really and stay true to our mission of helping patients.
Well, and then you also get the huge challenge of trying to get your software to run on many different platforms.
For sure.
You know, which is kind of like the Microsoft problem, right? So it's interesting to think about that now, because I was thinking when I asked the question that it's mostly about magnitude and complexity of the data, but it's actually much more about magnitude and complexity of the different stakeholder situations and environments that you would have to deal with in order to just gather the data in the first place.
For sure, yeah.
Excellent. So now I have a question for Danica.
Oh,
okay, go ahead. If you'd like to respond on the last one, please go ahead.
I would like to respond. So when we mentioned COVID-19 pandemics, one thing that came sort of clear and very much revealing is the fact that this lack of interoperability and standardization of the way how data are currently captured in the healthcare system. And just to give one example, the lab data across the country are completely fragmented. You don't in the way how they describe the data. So this goes, especially with the COVID-19 tests, they are all sort of described different way. You can imagine the nightmare of trying to put together really any comparative effectiveness in that space. So we've launched, along with public-private, along with partnerships outside of government, this initiative called SHIELD, which stands for Systematic Harmonization and Implementation and Exchange of the Lab Data, which is a major effort to try to have this fundamental work, so then folks like your researchers and others will actually have much cleaner space to operate with. We're still a long way to go, but it's something that has to be done.
Okay, so we had a related question, which is, you mentioned earlier that implementation lags, behind the ideas, formats, and standards, that come out from, all the research that you're doing at FDA and other government organizations. And I guess the question is whether or not implementation of those ideas should be outsourced to the private sector by the government versus just waiting, for private companies to pick up the torch. So does that make sense for the government to subsidize or even directly fund the private sector to build the software tools that we would need to make use of all of those new ideas and standards?
Yes, and I would also say that we're already doing it in a number of ways. There are current, obviously, grants, many of them in the device space that are, in fact, targeting these novel ways of generating, synthesizing, and appraising the evidence. We have, as I mentioned, the National Evaluation System for Health Technology Coordinating Center has their demonstration cases, use cases, which actually have a number of these topics under that umbrella. FDA also has grants that came through from the Core Trust Fund that we are working with a number of grantees and stakeholders in that space. I think the launch of the Digital Health Centers for Excellence and FDA, and many of you know that this had been just launched to serve all the medical product areas, is going to open a lot of opportunities for folks working together and understanding better where the true needs are. I would tell you that we definitely are huge proponents of private sector working together with government in this public-private partnership setting. We understand that we cannot do everything alone. And we know that the novelty and creative thinking actually is with academia and small developers who are actually coming up with innovative ideas. So I personally have been that has been a great passion of mine to try to find the ways of how this idea make it to the FDA, and I will continue to collaborate. And in this particular case, with Carolyn Rose on some of these efforts that we've already started in the space of the social media. Again, if you have any questions after this or any comments from folks, by all means, send them my way, and I'll try the proper home for any questions that you might have of FDA-related question.
Excellent,
thank you. So we have another question, which is.
All right, Eric, if I could just.
Go ahead, Jack.
Yeah, just like regarding the implementation of kind of standards to make data access easier. I got to see this quite a bit in that I was involved in a startup just prior to starting PhD that was basically trying to provide, I don't know if anyone uses mint.com.
The financial wellness?
Mint.com is a financial app that basically gives you the ability to like you connect to all of your different financial institutions, like your stock brokerage, your personal savings account, whatever, your mortgage lender, and you could see in one place some kind of complete view. So rather than saying I've got these 5 different credit card statements, you could look somewhere and say, okay, you know, this is how much money I have, this is how much this is how much credit card debt I have. This is the value of my home, this is whatever, and you can sort of see an overall picture of your financial life. And in that case, you couldn't ask for, so there's a few things worth noting. Like one is, in that case, you couldn't ask for data that was easier to reconcile because it's all expressed in the exact same denomination, which is US dollars. And initially it was built on top of, what was it called? Was it Yodlee or something? I forget, it was built on some startup that was basically scraping from financial websites initially. Like you gave them your password and then they log in and scrape it out of the HTML. But now it's like, it's actually built on top of APIs that have the bank's blessing and participation. So you couldn't expect for, you couldn't hope for some, like a better instance of like data sharing and where, you know, and like one thing worth noting is that it still breaks all the time, and that it often I'd say it's on the cadence of like once per week if you've got like 5 or 6 accounts, or that at least one of them, like the connection breaks and you can't access your data from it. The other side, we were trying to build something kind of similar, and this company is actually still doing well and going, you know, 8 years later, but of helping people basically who have their health records scattered across, you know, some of it they saw a specialist at UCSF, and then now they live in Pittsburgh and they have a doctor at UPMC, but they used to have a doctor in private practice in, you know, I don't know, Minnesota or something. How do you pull all of your health records into one spot? And what made us think that there was an opportunity to do something impactful in the space was as part of the Obama stimulus bill, they had something called meaningful use. And basically there were 2 instruments there, both financial for getting people to actually adopt certain standards for giving people access. So they had some list of things they want people to do: create these public facing health portals to access your data, abide by certain standards, eventually meet certain interoperability requirements. And basically what they said is, if you get this done by a certain deadline and can demonstrate that you did it, you got some of the stimulus money as like a subsidy to support the cost of getting up and going with electronic health records. And if you didn't get it done by some later date, then eventually you started getting fined. And you know, not surprisingly, while there still are some doctors that are entirely on paper records, for the most part, almost the entire country kind of moved their butts and actually got onto electronic health records, and that conformed to somewhat. So one side of that story is that ultimately, like, providing a financial kick in the butt, or, you know, a carrot and a stick, like, does actually kind of force some kind of action. And I think at some point, like, if there are standards that we need providers to get behind, I think the government, that's an instrument that, like, without that, it's probably, you can't get like the entire nation to move. But the other side of the story that maybe is like the less optimistic side is that while all these institutions did sort of get electronic health records that met the bare minimum of the requirements, it was usually just that. And so one thing that happened is a lot of these portals popped up that basically did whatever it happened to, like, conform to the letter of the law while still being as difficult to work with and as not quite interoperable as you could be while still complying. And so I think one thing that's worth anticipating is whenever you have some kind of regulation, you really have to anticipate, that all these kind of edge cases of how people will sort of, like, maybe sort of superficially comply with what you've asked them to do without maybe actually doing it.
Yeah, I hear you. So this is another angle. One of our audience is asking, will the variable of medical expertise be considered and discussed? So my guess is that you're assuming a certain level of medical expertise on the part of the end user of your system. And I know from personal experience that when you build a question answering system that's answering questions from medical professionals that are being answered from PubMed articles, It's a very different space than if you look at all of the personal health questions that get asked, for example, on Yahoo Answers. And we actually had a separate task in one of our yearly challenges that focused more on what we call consumer health questions. So for those of you who are doing on the research side, Zach and Carolyn, do you assume a certain level of medical expertise? And do you provide things like provenance, for the conclusions? I did see, some examples in what Sandeep was showing of links to, other reference material. But do you think there's a pitfall here that maybe we are assuming that the end user knows more or less than they actually do? Maybe Carolyn, you want to go first?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there are a huge number of questions in there. I think where it connects most to work that my group has done, I would point to our collaboration with NIH, where we are working on extracting information from medical records that might include records that have been recorded by different doctors. So some of which are general practitioners, others of which are specialists, some of which were specifically called in for some level of assessment, where in other cases you might be trying to infer things that maybe weren't the focus of a particular doctor's appointment, but are important to the end user who wants kind of a synthesized version of somebody's medical record. Another place where it plays in here is who is it whose opinion is being reported, because in the same medical record, you might have the doctor saying their interpretation of something. They may be saying what a test said. They might be reporting what the patient claimed. And these would be at different levels of authoritativeness. And that needs to be taken into account when the summarized record is constructed. So these are big problems. There's no easy answer. We have thought about these things. We want to be able to flag pieces of a summary and connect back to their source so that the adjudicators who are looking at that combined record have a way of going back and checking. So we do look for patterns in the language that would indicate a different status along these lines. And so we're working on that. But again, I would not assume that we have the complete information on that. And we're still working with experts at different levels to even get a sense of what would be ideal in terms of how we would handle those things. So I think that's a whole can of worms. And I think it's very interesting to think about those problems and definitely big, important problems. Still open.
So Zach, I saw those summaries you were generating that were very terse. And you're clearly not, giving attributions of who's saying what in those. So do you think what Carolyn is pointing out here could be an issue for effective summarization if you're not including some markers on the provenance of the elements in the summary?
So that's something that we actually are addressing. So one thing that was kind of cool about this data set, right, is that it doesn't just consist of conversations and corresponding summaries, but that we also have these, sorry, puppy came in chasing ice cubes. We also have these intermediate labels or these alignments that sort of say this sentence in the summary was, is supported by these corresponding utterances in the transcript. Okay. And in our approach, we're actually building this kind of modular approach, right? Which is not just saying, take the whole 20-minute transcript, dump into some giant neural network and out pops the summary, which turns out not even to be sort of viable just because of the size of these conversations. So you'd have to like truncate the conversation and generate a summary based on, some, subset. But our approach, which turned out to be, so it's our approach is basically first try to extract all of these sentences, because we now have supervision for like which sentences in the historical conversations were marked as sort of evidence supporting something that should go in the summary. So we could try to first extract those sentences and not just extract them like just say, are they supporting or not, but even corresponding to what subsection of the conversation. Then we group them together like, okay, these three contiguous maybe sentences should probably just together support a single sentence in the summary, and then we generate that sentence. So so there's sort of two benefits here. One is that just by like all of our objective performance metrics, both like sort of automated ones like Rouge score or human evaluations like the fraction of generated sentences that are factual, that are coherent, that are whatever, seems to be a better approach. But the other benefit is you actually now have this trace where you can say, if someone wants to say, why did you generate this? If nothing else, we can say, this was generated as a sort of, the abstractive module generated this summary sentence in response to these three particular utterances in the conversation. And someone could look back. And so one of the interesting things we've done is like done some analysis of look through examples of what did the model extract, what was generated. And it's interesting to see that, it's just a statistical, it's just a pattern matching system. So it will do, it will make some kind of leaps. And it is interesting to see, for example, if the doctor says, like the sentence where the doctor says the person should, I should also comment that the summarization module, you condition on which subsection of the note are you trying to generate. So you say, here's the group of sentences that are evidence, and the sentence that yours should be generating belongs to this subsection of the note, and then you should generate it. And if the doctor says something like, well, I want to start you on digoxin 2 times a day, or whatever, and then you generate the section that should correspond to chief complaint or to history of present illness, it'll say, history of heart disease. So it's, that's not exactly what was there. On the other hand, it is sort of a reasonable inference. It is an inference that if you were a doctor and you walked into the room and someone said they were putting you on a medicine that's only given for patients with heart disease, you would assume, okay, like I know something about this patient. There is that aspect.
Right, but that also, I think, gets back to what you were saying before, which is the most cost-effective ensemble of man and machine is one where you do try to fill in, the data that were not explicitly given. And I think there, the statistical model is probably what the doctor would want to see, right? What is the most likely reason why I would have said that, since I didn't say explicitly, what the diagnosis was. Excellent. So everyone, we're at the 3:30 mark here, which is the end of our scheduled time. If anyone has any further questions, please feel free to put them into the Q&A now. Otherwise, it's okay if you're ready to cut out. But I think some of us, at least on the panel, are happy to stay for a few more minutes. So we have one more question in the queue. Will this be purely a cloud-based solution deployment? And this came up when Sandeep was talking about full scalability. And I guess that's a real interesting chicken and an egg question, because if we want to be in the remote village in India where someone can use a landline telephone, how far out to the edge are we going to bring all of the data storage and HIPAA compliant VPN tunneling and all of that kind of stuff? So do you require the cloud, and does that actually place a constraint on how far out in the world you can go today with these kind of solutions?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, great question, because we've had a lot of requests for like on-prem deployments and like any number of like customization requests, but we stuck to the cloud-based deployment because even in the case of like landlines or like people having calls on a telehealth, it's very easy to like retrieve and store the data in a cloud that patients can in turn access at any time, anywhere on their mobile or like wherever we can display that output. So I think cloud-based solution, I think from an ubiquity standpoint and giving access to patients when and how they need it, I think has been crucial to us.
Well, and I think also it's the place where there are so far maybe the best, privacy and security guarantees, because there's been a big push, to safeguard, health data in the cloud as well. So it's kind of like a practical reality, I think, that we have to live with.
For sure. And I think that like the auditing of the data becomes much easier because like it's all like cloud trails, and there is like more visibility and transparency that we can provide to patients as well when they request. Deleting the data, if they want to delete the data, it's instant. Like, there is like no process required. So I think so much of this like workflow and all of that gets streamlined because things are in like one common repository in the cloud. So yeah, that and moreover, I think machine learning, right? It's very difficult to run some of these large networks on edges and all that stuff. So I think cloud-based deployments for like machine learning also like scales really well.
Great. So folks, we're out of questions. Would the panelists like to make any other remarks in conclusion? Anyone? All right, well, I'd like to thank you all for your participation today. This has been a wide-ranging and very stimulating discussion with all of you representing different viewpoints. And I think we got at some very important cross-cutting questions and got to hear from Danica sort of where things really are in the government sphere, which I think was very educational, certainly for me. And I'd also like to thank the audience, for their participation today as well. Your questions kind of brought life to this. And to, just reiterate, part of Dan's mission here is to make sure that any of you who are interested in following up with us and potentially engaging in research on any of these topics, please get in touch with Dan, and then he'll set up, appropriate follow-on meetings. There's a lot of cool stuff to work on here, and I hope we get to engage with some of you and sort of, moving the state of the art ahead on several of these.
Yes, thank you, everyone. And thank you, Eric, and our faculty, and Sandeep and Danica. Thank you all.
Thanks so much. It was our pleasure.
Thanks
for having us.
Bye.